Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an editorial from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This editorial deals with the topic of net zero emissions and the India-US Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 partnership. We also have a related article on page number 1 which refers to the visit of the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change, Mr. John Kerry, to India. During his recent visit to India, several important initiatives have been announced by India and the United States to enable the two countries to work together towards climate action and to adopt a low carbon green development path in order to restrict the global rise in temperatures to under 2 degrees Celsius or if possible under 1.5 degrees Celsius as per the target that has been laid down under the Paris Agreement of the Climate Change Convention. See, recently on the 2nd of September, we had an elaborate discussion on the topic of net zero emissions. In this session, I had explained in detail that net zero emissions is nothing but achieving carbon neutrality by not only bringing down your greenhouse gas emissions, but also by matching it with carbon capture and carbon sequestration in order to achieve net zero emissions. See, India has emerged as the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases after the United States and China. If you include the European Union as well, then India would be the fourth largest emitter. But these top emitters have already adopted their net zero emission targets, and the United States and the European Union have already pledged to achieve this target by the middle of this century. Whereas China, on the other hand, has pledged to achieve its net zero emissions target by 2060. So now that these top emitters have taken up a defined target, they are exerting a lot of pressure on India to announce a similar target with a clear deadline, which would then become binding on India under the terms of the Paris Agreement. So the global drive towards net zero emissions has been accelerated by the latest findings of the IPCC report and as well as by the rising frequency and intensity of extreme weather events around the world. There is clear-cut evidence available to point out that these extreme weather events are being driven by climate change and global warming, and this has created an urgent need to achieve immediate short-term reductions in emissions. Hence, the top emitters such as US, European Union and China have not only taken up this target, but they're also putting a lot of international pressure on India to come out with a similar target. See, these top emitters are pressurizing India on the basis of the latest findings of the IPCC report. The latest IPCC report has confirmed that human activity is the major contributing factor for global warming. The report has specifically pointed out that over the next 2 decades, the planet is likely to reach or even exceed 1.5 degrees of warming. And the report has found that 1.1 degrees of warming has already taken place over pre-industrial levels. So on the basis of these findings, the top emitters are pushing India as well to adopt net zero emission targets in order to achieve immediate short-term reductions in emissions. While this argument is valid, and while India understands and appreciates this argument, we should also take note of India's unique circumstances. Because see, switching to clean and renewable forms of energy and adopting carbon capture and carbon sequestration is a very expensive affair. Any such sudden transformation or shift will entail significant economic costs. And while India is already making tremendous progress in switching to clean renewable forms of energy and in adopting carbon capture, one cannot forget the fact that India still has every right to consume a large share of the remaining carbon budget of the world, along with several other small developing and underdeveloped countries, because we not only have low historical emissions, but we also have one of the low per capita emissions even today. Unlike these countries, India is not responsible for historical emissions. Plus, India's low per capita emissions shows that India has not fully utilized its share of the carbon budget. And for a country that is still dealing with severe socio-economic challenges and developmental challenges, it would be essential to continue on the current path where we not only consume fossil fuels within the prescribed limits, and at the same time, India is also making a massive transformation and leading the world towards adopting clean and renewable forms of energy. But however, it is right that India should rethink its development strategy. And not just India, but countries around the world, they will have to rethink their respective models of development and think of cleaner ways of providing transportation, constructing buildings, developing industries, and developing urban areas. So, in this regard, the latest visit of the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate Change is of great significance to India as the two countries have launched a new initiative. See, in the India US relationship, climate action and clean energy is one of the key areas of partnership. The two countries have even adopted the Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 partnership. And under this initiative, both the countries have launched the Climate Action and Finance Mobilization Dialogue during the recent visit of the US Special Envoy to India. Through this initiative, the US has committed to provide for financing and technology to India to enable India's shift towards cleaner and renewable forms of energy. This initiative is based upon three important pillars, and the first pillar is based on climate action, where the US is looking to help out India in curbing its carbon emissions. The second pillar is finance mobilization, through which the US is looking to fund India's ambitious shift towards clean and renewable forms of energy. And along with financial support, the US is also looking to provide technological support to help India achieve its ambitious target of 450 gigawatts of installed capacity of renewable energy by 2030. This would involve a faster adoption of electric vehicles, along with cleaner forms of fuel such as hydrogen. India has already emerged as a global leader with regard to the adoption of renewable forms of energy, especially in the domains of solar, and as well as with regard to electric and hybrid technologies. So the additional funding and technological support that would come in from the US would be of great help to India to achieve these ambitious targets. Then the third pillar of this dialogue is adaptation and resilience. This would provide for enhanced focus on managing the climate risks as the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events are going up around the world, and as natural disasters are being further aggravated by the impact of climate change and global warming. So as cyclones, forest fires, and floods cause more damage to the vulnerable areas, the focus should be on adapting to the reality in order to make our vulnerable regions more resilient to these disasters. The editorial points out that India is already well on its way to achieve its voluntary targets under the Paris Agreement, that is the intended nationally determined contributions, which we had covered in detail on the 2nd of September. India had laid down a goal of cutting its emissions intensity by 33 to 35% of its GDP. This target was supposed to be achieved by India by the end of this decade, and India has already achieved a 21% intensity reduction. Then with regard to renewables, India was supposed to achieve a target of 40% of electricity being generated from renewable sources. With regard to this target, India has made tremendous progress, and even with 9 years left for the deadline, India has already achieved 37.9% of installed renewable energy capacity. So even the US recognizes the tremendous progress that India has made with regard to clean energy and renewables. But as of now, the time is not right for India to adopt net zero emissions target, as it would involve a huge economic cost which could compromise India's development agenda. In this regard, the financial technical support from US would help India to further accelerate its climate action efforts. And most likely, India would be achieving neutrality somewhere around 2060. But the only problem for India is that we don't want to take up legally binding targets under the Paris Agreement. So the editorial is of the opinion that India should resist the pressure from US, European countries and China and stay away from adopting legally binding net zero emission targets, while it continues its accelerated push towards climate action and clean energy. And the added assistance from the US in this regard is going to help India to anyways push towards carbon neutrality somewhere around this period. In the meantime, India will have to focus on its internal policies and economic development initiatives, and it should work closely with the state governments and as well as the local administrations and local governments to carry out a complete rethink of its transportation model, along with its development of industries, urban areas, and construction of buildings. By keeping in mind the immediate impact of climate change, India will have to put in place an adaptation framework which will specifically focus on the most vulnerable sections and vulnerable regions. For example, the coastal areas are likely to witness the full impact of these extreme weather events, such as cyclones, floods, and rising sea levels. So, in this regard, all the three tiers of the government will have to work together to make the vulnerable regions more resilient towards these disasters so that they can adapt to the impact of climate change in the short term. Such adaptation measures, along with a renewed push towards clean energy and renewables, will also create more employment opportunities, thereby driving up India's development as well. So, in short, India will have to look at this international pressure with a positive outlook. And while it politely refuses to abide by the target, it will have to continue its engagement with countries like US, which could help India immensely towards expanding its mitigation and adaptation measures. Now let's take up a column from page number 7 that provides for an evaluation of the bilateral relations between India and Australia. This column has been published in the context of the first ever 2+2 ministerial dialogue, which was recently concluded between the two countries. See, a 2+2 ministerial dialogue is a diplomatic format under which the defense ministers and foreign ministers of the two countries interact simultaneously to discuss the foreign policy and national security issues that are affecting the two countries. So, such a 2+2 ministerial dialogue was conducted between India and Australia for the first time ever, and it represents the growing strategic closeness between the two countries. The writers point out that India and Australia have a lot in common, as both the countries are large democracies and open societies which have respected international law. The India-Australia bilateral relationship has grown by leaps and bounds over the last few years, and following last year's virtual summit between Prime Minister Modi and the Australian Prime Minister, the bilateral relations were elevated to the strategic level by establishing the comprehensive strategic partnership between the two countries. Following this, the two countries also elevated their 2+2 dialogue to the ministerial level, which until last year remained at the level of defense secretaries and foreign secretaries. By elevating this 2+2 dialogue to the ministerial level, the two countries have indicated the growing strategic convergence between the two sides. Then India followed this up by inviting Australia to the Malabar naval exercise, thus making the Malabar naval exercise a quadrilateral exercise. These growing strategic and defense relations, they signify the geostrategic and geo-economic convergence in the interests of India and Australia. And this strong strategic partnership is being built upon the foundation of strong people-to-people relations. Because the two countries have always enjoyed close people-to-people relations and cultural relations, and the people of both the countries and their institutions had managed to build a strong foundation for this relationship. And upon this foundation, the two countries are building a vital strategic partnership that is specifically focused on the Indo-Pacific region. As far as their strategic and military relations are concerned, both India and Australia have a common vision for the Indo-Pacific region. They both support the free and open nature of the Indo-Pacific, and they are determined to protect the freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific. Any country which threatens this basic right and any country which threatens the rules-based order is being viewed as a strategic threat by both India and Australia, and this is a reference to the increasing aggressive policies of China in the Indo-Pacific, where it has not only threatened and disrupted freedom of navigation, but it has also violated the rules-based order. So as the strategic and security threats grow in the Indo-Pacific, it will have direct consequences for the national interests of India and Australia, and this is what brings the two countries together in the maritime security domain. Under their comprehensive strategic partnership, India and Australia have prioritized maritime and regional security, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. And apart from all these bilateral initiatives, they are even engaging multilaterally through platforms such as the Quadrilateral. So by working with like-minded countries such as US and Japan, they are seeking to protect their strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific in order to build up a strong counter to the aggression of China. Even with regard to trade and commerce, India and Australia have really stepped up their relations. And as of last year, their bilateral trading volume stood at an impressive $24.4 billion. The two countries are further taking forward their economic relationship, and they have recently committed to work out an early harvest agreement by the end of this year, which will lay the foundation for signing a free trade agreement known as the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. In one of the previous classes, we had even discussed the decision of India and Australia to quickly conclude such an early harvest agreement, which will pave the way for a free trade agreement between the two countries. But however, if this strategic relationship has to flourish further, then both the countries need to address some of the pressing issues, especially in the domain of trade and commerce. See, with regard to bilateral trade, Australia is facing tariff barriers from India, and especially agriculture and dairy exports from Australia are facing a significant barrier in India. Through these high tariffs, India is seeking to protect its domestic industry. But however, considering the growing geo-economic convergence, it would be in the interest of both the countries to eliminate all forms of trade barriers. On the other hand, India also faces non-tariff barriers from the Australian side, especially with regard to its skilled professionals who are seeking to work in Australia and who are seeking to compete in the Australian labour market. They face stiff challenges and discriminatory policies as a result of the stringent visa and immigration policies of Australia. This is one area that India wants to be addressed by Australia to further take forward their economic relations and people-to-people relations. Today, the India-Australia relationship has diversified into several sectors, and it stretches across agriculture, artificial intelligence, education, cybersecurity, infrastructure and healthcare, agri-business, and as well as big data and fintech. So these strong economic relations will receive a further boost if they quickly finalize the free trade agreement and provide for the reduction of these trade barriers. And this geo-economic convergence, accompanied with the growing geostrategic convergence, is all set to make the India-Australia relationship a more meaningful partnership. Next, we have a column on page number 6, which deals with the repeated internet shutdown in India, where the government cites public emergency and public safety as a ground for shutting down internet and access to internet, and how it violates the fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. See, last year, in the landmark Anuradha Basin case, the Supreme Court had ruled that access to information via the internet is a fundamental right. While passing this landmark judgment, the Supreme Court had also observed that any restriction on access to internet and any shutdown of internet should be of temporary nature, and it should be restricted and proportional. The Supreme Court also had established a guideline that any such restriction or shutdown of internet has to be lawful and necessary. But despite these clear-cut guidelines in the Supreme Court, the centre and the state governments continue to blatantly violate the Supreme Court guidelines, and they continue to restrict internet, sometimes even on flimsy grounds, by citing national security, public emergency and public safety. The writers of the column point out that such repeated internet shutdowns in direct violation of the Supreme Court guidelines not only violates the constitutional rights of the citizens, but it also has a wide-ranging impact on the economic, social and psychological well-being of the citizens. Today, the internet has become the backbone of the economy, and such random shutdowns directly compromises the economic opportunities available to the citizens. Businesses, job seekers will find it immensely difficult to function and to achieve economic progress when there are such frequent internet shutdowns. Today, India has become infamous as the internet shutdown capital of the world, and governments continue to misuse the wide sweeping provisions of the Information Technology Act of 2000, despite the clear-cut guidelines that have been laid out by the Supreme Court. So in this regard, the writers point out how such frequent internet shutdowns erode trust between the citizens and the government, and how it compromises the access of citizens to valuable information. The writers even point out the failure of the parliament to bring in restrictions on the wide sweeping powers of the executive. So, on the basis of these points, the writers make a strong argument for the government to strictly abide by the guidelines of the Supreme Court with regard to internet shutdowns. Next, we have a column on page number 7 in which the writers evaluate India's progress towards the adoption of electric vehicles. See, widespread adoption of electric vehicles will bring tremendous advantages for countries like India. First, it will reduce our fossil fuel consumption, and thereby it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help India achieve its climate targets. And at the same time, it will reduce our dependency on fossil fuels and bring down import bills, and also further guarantee India's energy security. Then along with that, widespread adoption of electric vehicles will also help tackle the problem of air pollution. So in order to secure these benefits, India has pushed for the wider adoption of electric vehicles through the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan. Then in order to incentivize the design, development, production and adoption of electric vehicles, India even launched the ambitious FAME scheme, which stands for Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Electric and Hybrid Vehicles. Recently, the FAME scheme has been extended for another 2 years under the second phase of the initiative. This scheme seeks to incentivize the manufacturers and as well as the customers in order to scale up the adoption of electric vehicles. Today, even the state governments, like the government of Maharashtra, Gujarat, and the others, are coming out with their own electric vehicle policy to further support the industry. As a result of all these initiatives, many startups have come up and they are driving an electric vehicle revolution in India, and they are even pioneering the much needed battery technology. India is also drawing up ambitious plans to create sufficient recharging infrastructure. But however, what is surprising is that some of the leading auto manufacturers are still very hesitant and reluctant to embrace electric vehicles. While several startups such as Ola are pioneering the technology, and while they are directly contributing to the rapidly increasing sales of electric vehicles, leading automobile manufacturers are falling behind, and their involvement is absolutely essential if we have to scale up the adoption of electric vehicles. The large leading companies, they have the required capacity along with the required resources and technology to help India achieve this ambitious target. But the current small market available for electric vehicles has deterred the large players from entering the area, and they offer very few basic models in this segment. Hence, the writer is calling upon the government to further work closely with the industry, especially with the leading manufacturers, to rapidly scale up India's electric vehicle production, along with sufficient investments in battery technology and charging infrastructure. Next, according to this article on page number 10, the Indian Navy has donated a passenger variant of the Dornier aircraft, which is a transport aircraft, on lease to the National Coast Guard of Mauritius. This is an extension of the close defense relations between India and Mauritius, and India has a long history of supplying defense equipment to Mauritius in order to promote its maritime security and to safeguard its exclusive economic zone. In the past as well, India has gifted Dornier reconnaissance aircrafts for the defense forces of Mauritius, and India has even gifted the ALH Dhruv helicopters. In the past, the Indian Navy had even gifted INS Barracuda, which is an offshore patrol vessel, in order to help strengthen the National Coast Guard of Mauritius. And these defense platforms that has been provided by India has helped Mauritius and its armed forces to carry out effective surveillance in its exclusive economic zone and thereby strengthen the maritime security of this important island nation in the Indian Ocean. To further enable Mauritius purchase such defense equipment from India, India had even announced a line of credit And under this line of credit, the Navy has gifted a passenger variant of the Dornier aircraft on lease, which will help serve the transportation needs of the Coast Guard of Mauritius. These defense initiatives of India with Mauritius is in line with India's Sagar doctrine, and it will help further strengthen the strategic relations between India and Mauritius. Next, we have another article on page number 10 that reports an important development in Jammu and Kashmir. After waiting for 14 years, the Landmark Forest Rights Act has been implemented in Jammu and Kashmir, and this is expected to benefit around 1.4 million tribal population of the Union Territory of J&K, because the Forest Rights Act provides for special privileges to the forest dwelling communities and the traditional forest dwellers. This act recognizes their title rights, land rights, and usage rights, and even recognizes their right to collect forest produce, that is, minor forest produce, and it even allows the tribal communities to play a role in forest conservation efforts. These legal rights, enshrined under the Forest Rights Act, is expected to elevate the socio-economic status of several tribes of Jammu and Kashmir, including the Gujar Bakerwal community and the Gadi Sipi community of the Union Territory. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: there is escalating pressure for India to commit itself to a date when it can achieve net zero emissions. In this context, examine how engagement with the US can help India expand mitigation and adaptation action. The second question: the 2+2 dialogue between India and Australia will provide substance to an already meaningful partnership. Analyze. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be shared in the description box below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.